The Resurrected Old Woman. Written by Johhny. Greta Stepanovna, a confident woman of many years who had sinned only once in her life, and even so long ago that 80% of her life had passed since, making it hardly worth remembering, had grown tired of her existence, or to put it simply, died. Reaching 99, one could say, was a feat. In that time, she managed to outlive both her daughters and one granddaughter. Her most common phrase over the past 20 years was, "If only not to 100, and that's exactly how it turned out. She fell short of her 100th birthday by exactly 1 month and 1 day. It should be said that Greta Stepanovna, born Maria Vasilyevna, had a very dark sense of humor. At 45, she changed her patronymic from Vasilyevna to Stepanovna because she was not entirely sure her father was her biological father, and at 62 she changed her first name from Maria to Greta, completely baffling all her relatives who had known her all their conscious lives as Maria, or more often simply Masha. They now had to retrain themselves to use a new name, and the old woman transformed from Granny Masha into Granny Greta. She would also often mutter that after her death she wanted to be buried with her dog, Liolik, in the backyard, and instead of a coffin, they should stick a pole in the ground. She justified this by saying she lived like a dog and ought to die no better, though in the end she died in her bed, unlike Liolik. Liolik had fallen under the wheels of a car, and no matter what they told Granny Maria, now Granny Greta, she refused to budge. Like a dog, and that's it. As the classic would say, closer to death. Greta Stepanovna died in her own bed, in her own house within the city limits. Burying her in the ground next to Liolik, considering common sense, wasn't really an option. Since she had long outlived all her friends and relatives, no one planned to spend much on her funeral. No one would come anyway. But then there was one snag that halted everyone. Greta Stepanovna had left a will, and she had things to bequeath. Over 99 years she had managed to accumulate several plots of land, and since World War II she had managed to secure a slice of dividends. But here was the problem. That damned Liolik, long buried and universally hated by Greta's family, his death may well have been arranged, had become the point of contention. In her will, Greta required that her entire estate be passed to her descendants rather than to a retirement home, but only on the condition that she be buried next to Liolik. Burying the old woman on land her descendants had already mentally divided among themselves, and on which they were ready to build a new modern house, was not something they wanted or planned to do. After consulting with lawyers, they all agreed that the body did not need to be buried in its intact form. Cremation would suffice. They could scatter her ashes over Liolik. Everyone liked and accepted the idea. They decided not to take Greta Stepanovna to the morgue, but instead to bring her straight to the crematorium the day after her death. 7 people gathered, her daughter, 2 granddaughters, 3 great-grandchildren, and her caregiver. They loaded Greta Stepanovna into the hearse and headed to the crematorium. She was dressed in her favorite house robe and white slippers. She had bought those slippers 17 years earlier and constantly joked that she would enter heaven in them because other colors weren't worn in the heavens, and she didn't want them to change her footwear there. No amount of reasoning that slippers wouldn't be needed in the afterlife could convince or dissuade her. So they put her own slippers on her. Early in the morning, Greta Stepanovna was lying on a gurney in front of the so-called doors to hell, through which she was supposed to pass into heaven, and to Liolik. All 7 people, shedding not a single tear and occasionally recalling her sharp comments, waited for the furnace door to open and for Granny Greta to be rolled inside. They suddenly remembered that until 62 she had still been Masha. And when they were asked how to formally register the deceased, the relatives hesitated. By her old name or the new one? They unanimously decided to go with the one they were used to, Greta Stepanovna Zileman. When Greta Stepanovna was half a meter from the furnace, she suddenly felt a paradoxical thing, that she'd had enough rest, and to everyone's astonishment, she rose. Greta Stepanovna sat up. She looked around and asked why it was so cold. The caregiver and one of the granddaughters immediately fainted. For them it was a shock that the woman who had been dead yesterday and earlier that very morning had suddenly resurrected and sat up. No one cared about the inheritance anymore. All that Greta Stepanovna said once she sat up, looked around, and realized where she was. At least you put the slippers on. Then she slid off the gurney on her own and walked toward the light, meaning outside. Deep down, she was profoundly displeased with this approach to her funeral, and she made sure to mention it in the rewritten will. She specified the exact location of her burial, the material of the coffin, and the burial depth. And yes, Greta Stepanovna did indeed live to 100, but now she celebrated 2 birthdays. With her sharp and witty humor, she began comparing herself to Jesus Christ, and would constantly repeat, especially on her 2nd birthday, that this was the second coming of Tsileman. Few people came to the second coming, though not many attended the first. There was resentment toward Greta Stepanovna. After all, they had already divided everything among themselves, and then this happened.